I'd like to start out with Mr. Lindsey. There are a lot of questions about specific things that the question would be what supporters of this question would say are the risks involved here, and what in turn should the public be afraid of if State Question 77 passes. So please tell us what this measure would do and what the consequences would be if it doesn't pass.
Sure. Thank you all very much for coming. It is a pleasure to be here. Any chance I get to come to Stillwater during homecoming week, I'm excited to be back anywhere near campus. But Oklahoma's farmers and ranchers asked the legislature to put this question on the ballot in the spring of 2015 because we've been watching what's happening around the country. And we've seen animal rights activists, environmental activists across the country come into states and try to mandate how livestock producers raise animals, how farmers and ranchers produce the food that goes on your table, and want to dictate everything from how big a pen should be for an animal, want to tell consumers what you can buy at the grocery store. And there are examples all across the country of that, from California to Ohio, Florida, Michigan, Colorado. A lot of times we talk about California because it's the best case study that we have today. But this is an effort that's taking place all across the United States. And we decided that it was important to try to get in front of those issues and to limit the opportunity for them to come to Oklahoma and mandate to the people that work every day to put food on your table, provide the fiber for your clothes. We thought those folks deserve protection. And what we do, I had a past president of the Pork Council once who told me, we're feeding the world, it's a noble profession. And I think it very much is a noble profession, and this is one way that we can protect that profession as we go forward. Try to limit the ability of out-of-state groups to come into Oklahoma and dictate to farmers and ranchers how we ought to be raising food in this state.
Mr. Edmondson, a similar question. There have been similar amendments passed in other states, North Dakota and Missouri, I believe. But no one apparently has pointed yet to anything that has occurred in those states that would seem to show there would be dire consequences for Oklahomans if 777 passes. Why should we oppose this amendment, and what will happen if it's approved?
Well, it's a little early to tell about North Dakota and Missouri. North Dakota passed theirs in 2012. Missouri passed theirs in 2014. So there's been a short period of time for anything to happen in those states. We do know that in Missouri, the Right to Farm Amendment has been cited in litigation. We don't think it's had a big effect yet, but it has already been brought up, and we do know that the number of concentrated animal feeding operation permits has gone up in Missouri since they adopted the right to farm. But basically, I agree with the Enid News and Eagle that says essentially 777 is a solution looking for a problem. Because whenever we ask what has happened in Oklahoma to give rise to this concern that we need this preemptive piece of legislation in our Constitution, the answer has always been, well, look at other states. Look at California. Look at Massachusetts. See what they've done. And I think tonight will not be an exception. They've never pointed to anything that's happened in the state of Oklahoma to give rise to a concern that the animal rights advocates are somehow going to take over a legislature that currently boasts 70 out of 101 House members with 100% voting records with the Farm Bureau, and 47 out of 48 members of the Senate with 100% voting records with the Oklahoma Farm Bureau. This is not California. We don't need this, but we do need the ability to react to things in the agricultural arena in future years, and 777 would take that away.
I'd like just to share a few facts that we've researched about the agricultural industry for those of you who aren't closely associated with it, and especially for those of us who live in the cities. In 2012, it was a $7 billion industry. 3/4 of it was from animal-related products, livestock, poultry, dairy, hogs. Only 25% of the cash receipts were for crops. Winter wheat was the king. About 6 in 10 agricultural operators, for them, farming is not their primary occupation. 9 of 10 operations are owned by families or individuals, so the small farmer exists. But money-wise, a small percentage produce quite a bit of the crops and animal-related products. Many operations contract with larger companies with agreements, the buyer stipulating what the farmer will grow or produce. That may be simplifying it somewhat, but that's the basic situation. I'd like to ask Mr. Lindsey, are there any other facts or any other context you think people should know about what the picture is for agriculture in Oklahoma?
Sure. Recently, USDA Secretary of Agriculture Tom Vilsack was quoted as saying that we ought to be thankful for our farmers, and we ought to be appreciative of what they do. That there's less than 2% of the population that's actively engaged in agriculture, and that 2% that's engaged in agriculture allows the rest of us to live in Oklahoma City. They allow us to be an attorney, they allow us to be a journalist, they allow us to be a banker, they allow us to do things that don't require us to raise our own food. And at the end of the day, if you think back, you know, if you think back nostalgically, if you will, on agriculture at a time when there was a big red barn everywhere and had a white picket fence and all that, what's different today versus then is everyone lived on the farm then. Everyone grew their own food. And today that doesn't happen. And so when you think about the impact of agriculture, and you think about how agriculture impacts your everyday life, the biggest impact for most Oklahomans is you can go to the grocery store and you can pick out what you want from a very wide selection of the food that's available at the grocery store. The safest, most abundant, most affordable food supply in the world. And what we're asking you to do by voting yes on this question is to protect your own choices at the grocery store and to protect that safe, affordable, abundant food supply for all of Oklahoma and for the rest of the country for that matter.
Same question, Mr. Edmondson. What should people keep in mind about what the agricultural industry looks like now?
Well, the agricultural industry has changed a lot over the last several decades. There's still a huge majority of farms in Oklahoma that are family-owned, say 90%. But 90% of the production, particularly in animal agriculture, comes from large industrial hog operations and poultry operations, not from the small family farms. And I can tell you from 16 years as Attorney General, 90% plus of the problems come from the huge animal operations, not from the family farms. In 16 years, we filed litigation in northwestern Oklahoma trying to protect water supplies from hog farm sewage lagoon spills, and the same thing in eastern Oklahoma from surface application of poultry waste. Never sued a farmer, never sued a family farm. It was always Seaboard and Pig Improvement Corporation and Smithfield Farms and Tyson and Simmons and the other huge poultry operators. Those are the ones who are causing the problems environmentally, and those are the ones who would benefit the most by passage of 777, not their next-door neighbors, small farmers who are concerned about their well water and their spring water because of these huge operations.
Mr. Lindsey, in this proposal, in the amendment, there was the phrase compelling state interest. Why is that clause in there? That would require strict standards, strict scrutiny for any legal challenges. I don't believe that's in the North Dakota amendment or in the Missouri amendment. Why did you want to add that? That's a very high hurdle to clear, right?
The language in both North Dakota and in Missouri just says plainly, the legislature shall adopt no law. That's what it says, shall adopt no law. And when we looked at it, we believed agriculturalists, in my opinion, are the first and the truest environmentalists that exist. They're the folks that live on the farm. They're the folks that depend on clean water. They're the folks that depend on that so they can raise the food and fiber that you enjoy. And so when we thought about that, we believed there were certain things the legislature should act to protect. And water quality certainly would rise to that level. And so we wanted a caveat in there that allowed the legislature to continue to act in things that were genuinely in the best interest of the public. In layman's terms, things that satisfied public safety, public health, public welfare. Things like food safety would rise to that level. Again, water quality. And current Attorney General Scott Pruitt has said publicly that all of this notion that our farms would be unregulated, that we would just blanketly be able to pollute the water, he said that's just nonsense, that the compelling state interest language clearly would allow for the legislature to still regulate clean water. The caveat in that would be they would have to regulate it in the least restrictive manner possible. And I think for most Oklahomans, the notion of regulations being the least restrictive they need to be, that rises to the top of their list of how they think government ought to operate. And so we included compelling state interest. We asked for it. We wanted it to be in there because we believed there needed to be an out for the legislature to act in certain instances, clean water being the best example. So this notion that the no side keeps saying about us being unregulated or being deregulated or not being able to regulate it in the future is just nonsense. It's not the fact of the matter. And again, Attorney General Pruitt has said publicly that clean water clearly rises to the level of a compelling state interest, and we would be able to regulate it. And we thought that was important to protect our natural resources going forward.
Any thoughts, Mr. Estes?
Well, fortunately or unfortunately, it won't be Attorney General Scott Pruitt deciding whether a particular piece of legislation or a municipal ordinance or a Department of Agriculture rule or regulation violates the compelling state interest. It will be judges deciding whether those regulations are appropriate under the Constitution. It's very interesting. I'm not sure where the compelling state interest language came from. You know, the president of the Oklahoma Farm Bureau says it came from Scott Pruitt. A spokesman for Attorney General Scott Pruitt denies it, said it didn't come from them. So I'm not sure where it came. It wasn't in the original ALEC right to farm, the American Legislative Exchange from 20 years ago. It wasn't in the North Dakota provision. It wasn't in the Missouri provision. This is original with Oklahoma. It is the highest burden in civil law. It is the same protection that's given to your church, to your right to vote, to your freedom of speech. These things are protected and would require government to show a compelling state interest to violate. No other industry, no other business is protected that way in our Constitution or in the U.S. Constitution. This is new territory, and judges are going to be deciding what goes and what doesn't go if 777 is on the books.
Before we go to the audience, just a follow-up from Mr. Lindsey. Some would say that they are skeptical that the industry will be responsible in terms of protecting public safety and being very mindful of practices in ranching and farming that would create issues. The chicken farms were around for years. Some would say, and I'm not making this case for it, horse slaughter is legal again. I think the Farm Bureau opposed the anti-cockfighting ballot many years ago. Why should we believe that you're going to be very careful about the practices of agriculture?
Sure, you bring up a number of, I think, important issues for us to address, and I'm going to start with cockfighting, for example. You mentioned in your introduction that legislation that was on the books in 2014 remains on the books. Those were all grandfathered in. Last I read, cockfighting was illegal in 2014, and cockfighting will be illegal in the future. Nothing in 777 changes that. Nothing in 77 is going to allow for the expansion of puppy mills is another argument that you hear. Those are arguments that are designed to create confusion amongst the public. And I got to give credit, I think. They've done a nice job of creating confusion. But those arguments are just nonsense. They simply aren't true. There is nothing in this question that's going to allow for the expansion of, or reinstatement of cockfighting, if you will. We're very blessed, I think, within the yes side. When you think about who's endorsing this question, who's supporting this question, one of those groups is the Oklahoma Veterinary Medical Association. And if there's any group out there whose sole purpose in life is to take care of our animals and protect them and see that they're well cared for, it's our veterinarians. And so we're very pleased to have the endorsement of OVMA in full support of State Question 777. Now, our farmers and ranchers get up every day. We like to tell folks we operate with a set of ethical principles in the pork industry, and top on that list is animal care. We have to care for our animals. If we don't provide for them, they don't provide for us. And so it's just a false notion that we're not going to take care of our animals, that we're not going to take care of our land. If we don't take care of our land, it won't produce crops. There's just not an incentive to not take care of the land and to take care of our animals.
Would you use the passage of State Question 777 to oppose, say, phasing in restrictions on use of small cages, battery cages, such as what happened in California?
We believe that when you look at battery cages, if you will, in California, there's no food safety reason for changing how we raised hens in California. There's no real animal welfare. There are pros and cons to all kinds of housing system for hens, if you will. And we believe the folks that are best equipped to make those decisions are the farmers and their veterinarians that provide care every day, not the legislature. And what you saw in California following the adoption of Proposition 2 was the legislature realized that they had put the egg industry in California in a real bad position, and that it was going to be more expensive for them to raise eggs in California because they were going to have to expand farms just for more space. And it had an impact on the supply of eggs. Now, avian influenza hit about the same time. It also had an impact on the supply of eggs. But when you factor out avian influenza, according to Bloomberg, eggs in California are 40 to 50 cents a dozen more expensive than they are in New York, and they're 47 cents a dozen more expensive than they would be without Proposition 2. And because the legislature came in and said all eggs now sold in California must be produced under these standards. It's the same effort that the Humane Society of the United States is making in Massachusetts. All eggs there must be produced in this fashion. And ultimately, the impact of that for every Oklahoman is you'll have fewer choices at the grocery store. Today, you can choose conventionally produced eggs, you can choose cage-free eggs, you can buy organic eggs. Whatever your pocketbook will allow and whatever you think is appropriate, you can buy. And every time you buy a product, you tell the farmer and rancher what you think is important and what we ought to be doing. We don't need the animal rights activists telling us how best to care for our animals. We do it every day. So that's my read on why this is important to Oklahoma and how that's just not how Proposition 2 has impacted California.
Okay. Mr. Edmondson, you're invited to share your thoughts on that, but I'd also like to ask one question of you. The Humane Society of the United States has taken various stances, and I think one question people have is, would an underlying agenda in opposing 777 be part of the mission of the Humane Society to eventually take meat and eggs off the American table? I mean, they promote meatless Mondays. They say they want to reduce meat consumption gradually. Is that the larger purpose of this opposition?
Well, number one, it's not the purpose of the opposition. The Humane Society is opposed to this because it's bad law and bad government, and because they had to fight the legislature for a long time and ultimately go around the legislature to get the cockfighting ban on the ballot. The important thing is that the Humane Society of the United States or PETA or anybody else can't write a law in Oklahoma. They are powerless to enact legislation in Oklahoma. They would have to go to the Oklahoma legislature or to the people of the state of Oklahoma to get anything done. And I've said it before and I'll say it again, PETA couldn't pass a kidney stone in Oklahoma, much less a statute. So we're going to rely upon the good sense of the people of the state of Oklahoma. Now, very briefly on the eggs in California, because I don't want to spend a long time on that. This is a 2008 proposition that passed by the people of the state of California. It was their decision on how they wanted eggs produced. They did not say the birds had to be cage-free. They said the birds had to be able to stand up, turn around, and move their wings, which is not an incredibly drastic statement. They were given 7 years to phase it in, which they did. The price of eggs went up in 2015 because of bird flu. They went up everywhere in the United States. And in 2016, the Secretary of Agriculture in California is concerned that the price of eggs there is so low They're concerned that egg producers can't make enough to buy the feed for their chickens. So let's just dispense with the price of eggs in California. That's not relevant to our debate here today. What is relevant is, while the laws that were on the books as of December 31st, 2014 are not disturbed by 777, neither are they protected. The legislature is free to do anything with those statutes that they want to. And with the Farm Bureau controlling 70 out of 101 House members and 47 out of 48 senators, I would say they can get anything done they want done, which means you don't have to repeal the ban on cockfighting. All you have to do is lower the penalty to $25. It's the price of doing business. The same with puppy mills, horse slaughter, or anything else. But fundamentally, what we're concerned about is agricultural practices are not frozen as of December 31st, 2014. They are free to evolve, as they should be, which means in future years we're going to have new herbicides, new pesticides, new genetic modifications, new antibiotics, new procedures, new technologies, all of which will be protected in the Constitution of the state of Oklahoma, and you, the people of the state of Oklahoma, are going to be powerless to react if one of them proves to be a bad idea. Because when it happens and you pass an ordinance or a statute and you end up going to court and a judge is going to decide, it's not going to be the farmer on the other side of the table. It's going to be Monsanto or Dow or whoever produced what it is that's causing the harm.
If I may, and I apologize, but there are a couple of things there that I think we need to, that I need to respond to. But first is, if it's a new herbicide or it's a new pesticide or it's a new animal feed additive, whatever it may be, all those things are already regulated at the federal level, and nothing in this state question is going to change that. So to say that it's going to be a blanket and we can go do whatever we want and bring it to Oklahoma and we're going to be powerless, that's simply not true. The federal government already does those things, and they're going to continue to do those things. The other question that I have, and I've fought with this a little bit and struggled as I try to rationalize it, but on one hand, Mr. Edmondson tells us we should trust the legislature. They will do what's right for Oklahoma. We should let them continue to have that power, and there shouldn't be a limit on it like we're suggesting. And on the other, he says, hey, wait a minute, don't pass this because the legislature might do something silly, and then how do we fix it? So we either can trust them, or we need some limits on where they are, but it seems to me that you keep suggesting that we can have it both ways. And we would argue that the compelling state interest language we've included allows us to protect food safety, allows us to protect our environment, and so we still protect the things that are important to Oklahomans. We just also protect the ability of that small percentage of the population to put food on your table every day.
Let's open it up for questions to the audience. Please raise your hand if you have a question. We encourage you to do so. Here's a question.
Jim Rutledge, I'm just a citizen here in Stillwater. One of the things that I look at when I look at a ballot measure is who's for and who's against. And I guess I would ask both Mr. Lindsey and Mr. Edmondson to indicate where the support is coming for the pros and the cons.
Good question. Mr. Edmondson, you want to start?
Yeah, I was looking for my cheat sheet. As Roy Lee has said, every agricultural organization that you can think of is in favor of 777. Very few organizations, if any, that are not agricultural have come out in favor of 777. Those on the other side saying that 777 is a bad idea include, as you would expect, animal rights groups and environmental groups, but also includes the Oklahoma Conference of Churches, the League of Women Voters, the Oklahoma Municipal League, the Central Oklahoma Governments, the 5 civilized tribes, Intertribal Council, the Choctaws, Chickasaws, Cherokees, Creeks, and Seminoles, the city councils of Oklahoma City, Tulsa, Edmond, The Village, Broken Bow, Choctaw, City councils all across the state of Oklahoma, Tahlequah, Muskogee, they're concerned about their ability to protect their water sources. They're also concerned about their ability to regulate land that's zoned agricultural but within the city limits. That's a big concern for municipalities. In addition to that, there are a number primarily of small farmers and small farming groups that are also opposed to 777. Sue Selman, who is a centennial rancher from Harper County, Oklahoma, just wrote a very eloquent letter to the editor of the Woodward News saying that she's on a centennial farm and she's concerned about this because she says you have a different view on the back of a tractor than you do in a corporate boardroom. And when she sits on her back porch having a cup of coffee, she wants to make sure that the water that she's looking at is clean and that the air is pure, and she's against 777.
I think when you look at the groups that are supporting this question, Mr. Edmondson's right. Agriculture across this state is supporting this question, whether it's the Oklahoma Cattlemen's Association, the Oklahoma Farm Bureau, Oklahoma Farmers Union, American Farmers and Ranchers, the Oklahoma Cotton Council, the Oklahoma Wheat Growers, the Oklahoma Pork Council. I mentioned earlier the Oklahoma Veterinary Medical Association. They're all Oklahomans, and they're the folks that are working tirelessly every day to put food and fiber on your table. They're the folks that put the eggs in your meat case. They're the folks that put the pork chop and the bacon in your breakfast or your dinner. Sorry, beef guys, I'll say steak in a minute, okay? That's where the money's come from. You notice Mr. Edmondson didn't acknowledge, he did say the animal rights activists, but he didn't tell you who they were. The single largest donor to his campaign or his organization, according to their June report, was the Humane Society of the United States. And you asked earlier about HSUS and their involvement and why, and you mentioned their goal of reducing meat protein, animal protein from your plate. If you go further into their 3 R's, the third R is to replace meat from your dinner plate. Not remove, not reduce it, but to remove it, replace it on your dinner plate. And I think that is absolutely contrary to what most Oklahomans believe we ought to be doing with agriculture. And so yes, I fully admit to you, agriculture as a whole is who's supporting this question. Go look at where our dollars have come from. They've come from Oklahomans and they've come from the Oklahoma agricultural community. And we're proud of that, extremely proud of that notion. I think if you went and asked the Hitch family in Guyman, Oklahoma, again a centennial producer, centennial farm, been there since before statehood, you'd find Jason Hitch stand up and tell you this is absolutely what we need to continue to feed this state and feed this country. So yeah, there are going to be folks on both sides. If you think about the Farm Bureau, their membership's overwhelmingly family farmers. If you think about the Oklahoma Cattlemen's, their membership's overwhelmingly family farmers. Oklahoma Farmers Union, there hasn't been a more anti-corporate agriculture group in the state than Oklahoma Farmers Union, American Farmers and Ranchers. These are your friends, they're your neighbors, they're your family. And those are the folks that are supporting this question. It's a great question, and I hope it's one that everyone considers when they go to vote.
Thank you. A question over here.
Clay Bertram, farmer and rancher here in Payne County, Oklahoma. Mr. Edmondson, you alluded to it a little bit, but HSUS is supporting this almost totally 100%, funding the No campaign. And one thing Roy Lee didn't mention is that one of their statements, if you'll read a little further, is the abolishment of animal agriculture. I make part of my living for animal agriculture. So why can you sit there and tell me that a no vote is going to keep me in business?
Well, because you're being put out of business not by the Humane Society of the United States, regardless of what their positions are, and I don't agree with many of their positions myself. You're going to be put out of business by JBS, a Brazilian cattle buyer. You're going to be put out of business, if you're put out of business at all, by the marketplace. The number of small cattlemen has declined dramatically over the last 10 or 20 years, and it hadn't been because of regulation. It hadn't been because of animal rights advocates. It's been because of market economics. And 777 will help the very people that's driving down the number of small cattlemen in the state of Oklahoma and across the nation.
This has nothing to do about markets.
Well, it has everything to do. If in a future legislature someone decided to compel cattle buyers to buy from all sources, small producers as well as large producers, that legislation would be challenged under 777 and ruled unconstitutional. It has everything to do with market economics.
The simple fact is, though, that the market will mandate where we go. And agriculture producers will respond to the marketplace. We don't need others to come in and tell us how we should respond. I don't need someone to tell me that I ought to do away with conventionally produced eggs and move to cage-free eggs. If the marketplace goes out and buys cage-free eggs, we'll produce them. If you tell me you want a pig raised in the pasture with a pillow to sleep on, under the stars every night, and you'll pay me the premium that it costs me to do it, I'll find you dozens of people who will go raise you that pig. But the simple fact is, the environmental regs, the animal care regulations that have come about do drive up the cost, and they make it prohibitive for these young people that you see back here. Really excited to see these young people back here listening to this discussion. But it makes it very difficult for them to get into farming and ranching today just because of the overwhelming cost to get started.
Thanks. Well, just a question here.
Yes, I had a question concerning the groups you were talking about earlier. And one thing you said was that primarily you thought, yes, of course, there were animal rights groups and environmental groups involved. However, one group that wasn't mentioned during that are an awful lot of newspapers across Oklahoma have come out against 777. In fact, the Tulsa World just recently, here's a line from their editorial stance, the Tulsa World, among many, many other newspapers across Oklahoma.
You have a question?
It doesn't solve any real Oklahoma problems, and its potential to create new problems in the future makes it bad policy. Well, our senator here, Senator Halligan, and our state representative, Corey Williams, opposed this, even getting even to this ridiculous level of the ballot at this point. When HJR 1012 was floated, they both voted against it. We're an agricultural county and a town, but
sir,
our rep and senator voted against it. So my question is, if this is bad policy, what do both of you think is the reason why our newspapers and even our local rep and senator, what is it that they are considering such bad policy about 777?
Who wants to take it?
Well, in most of the editorials that you talked about, Tulsa World, the Moore American, the Muskogee Phoenix, the Journal Record, the Tulsa Voice, the Ebony Tribune, and the Enid News and Eagle, in most of those editorials, they say the same thing that I started off with here tonight, that this is a solution in search of a problem, that nothing has happened in Oklahoma to justify amending our Constitution and adding a new right to an industry along with our freedom of speech and our freedom of religion. And absent a compelling interest to change the Constitution, they say the potential for harm is too great and that we shouldn't adopt it. And that's the rationale that most of those editorials have taken, as well as most of the city councils that have voted to oppose 777 as well.
Your thoughts on why these councils and newspapers have taken those positions? Mr. Lindsey.
I'll start with the comment that I made earlier. We've got 2% of the population that's involved in agriculture. It's a very small percentage of the population. I don't think there's many folks in Tulsa that are involved in production agriculture. I don't think there's many folks in Muskogee that are involved in production agriculture. And so when you think about that, they're not talking for the agriculturalists across this state. When I look at it, and I've been asked a number of times, why does this need to be a constitutional amendment? And my answer to that, I think, is pretty simple. Why do we want to protect agriculture versus some other industry? Name me another industry that you absolutely cannot survive without. I might not like it if I didn't have my cell phone, but I could function without it. I might not be happy walking everywhere, but I could get around if I didn't have a car to drive. But I'm not going to last very long if I don't have food to eat on my plate 3 times a day. And in my case, maybe it's more often than that. This is about protecting our ability to feed ourselves. And while Mr. Edmondson keeps saying, you know, this is a solution in search of a problem. Tell that to the folks that were raising hogs in Florida when they banned the use of gestation stalls in Florida and put those hog farmers out of business. They didn't know they had a problem either until they were out of business. This is an idea that's designed to keep us from having a problem. It's designed to prevent the problem from arising. I think we all talk about government being reactive and reacting too quickly or exceeding when they react to things. This is a prospective measure that's designed to prevent being overreactive and overreaching. Mm-hmm. That's why agriculture is supporting it.
Thanks. Question here.
Good evening, Christy Bishop. My question for you, Drew Edmondson, and Roy Lee just really touched on this, but you say it's a solution looking for a problem. I own insurance on my home, on my car. My house hasn't burnt down, but I still have that insurance. I assume you do on your home as well. Why do you think that our Oklahoma farmers and ranchers don't deserve that same protection, that same kind of insurance? Why should we have to wait until we're put out of business to recognize that there is a threat and a problem out there?
That same argument could be used by the bankers of Oklahoma if they wanted a constitutional amendment saying that we're not going to regulate banks unless there's a compelling state interest. Oil and gas industry, who might come to the legislature and say, well, we want a constitutional amendment saying you can't regulate oil and gas unless you got a compelling state interest. And, you know, what about the trucking industry? You can grow all the crops and pigs and chickens you want, but if you can't get them to market in a truck, you aren't going to be in business. So that's pretty indispensable too. So why don't we have a constitutional amendment protecting the trucking industry? Because we don't do that. And frankly, Roy Lee, you may have the statistics on this. I don't know that hog producers in Florida went out of business. I don't know that any egg producers in California went out of business. As far as I can tell, they're still manufacturing a lot of eggs in California and selling them not only in that state but in other states as well. And I'm not saying that you should regulate for regulation's sake, but when we say that, that poultry producers can spread the litter on the land without regulation and it runs off into the streams and pollutes the river and the lake, you know, we had a regulation on the books, and it had the amount, number of tons per acre that could be put down, but it also said in the statute, in no event, may surface application of waste result in runoff to the streams of the state, and that was being violated right and left. And, you know, where were the regulations when the poultry industry put arsenic in their feed to try to do away with varmints in the chickens, but it ended up in the soil, and it gets taken up and ends up in the cattle who ate the grass on the land where the poultry litter was spread, and then it ends up in human beings. The same with antibiotics. Those are things that in the future we may want to look at and we may want to deal with, and we don't need to handcuff ourselves as a people, as a state, or as a legislature in dealing with those issues in the future. And that's what 777 is, self-imposed handcuffs.
Other questions? There's a question right here.
I'm Carolyn Meyer. I live here in Stillwater. And I was wondering if this right to farm, also known as right to harm, state question passes, how is it going to affect my rights as a citizen who lives here and doesn't farm, as well as the rights of some of the other city councils and communities and the county people as well, the county commission and all those entities. Also, our Stillwater News Press came out against it as well.
Mr. Lindsey, you want to address that?
Well, I think quite simply it's not. It's not going to impact your rights as a citizen here. Matter of fact, it's going to protect your rights. It's going to protect your ability to go to the grocery store and choose the food produced in the manner you wish every time you go to the store. It's going to provide choices for you. It's going to provide choices for all Oklahomans. It's going to protect those choices when you go to the store. So I don't see it as doing anything to impact your rights. I think the issues, and I've said this previously, but the reason we included the language about compelling state interest is we believe there were things the legislature should regulate. and were things the legislature should be granted the authority to do. And those included clean water. They include food safety. That's why we included the language on compelling state interest. It's not some boogeyman that's out there. It is really to give the legislature a guide and a goal. And ultimately, I think if the legislature genuinely looked at what was best for all of Oklahoma every time they adopted a law, I think we'd all go, hey, that's a good idea, and that's what we should be doing.
Do you have any thoughts?
Yes, I do have a thought on that. And first, let me reemphasize what I've said before, that compelling state interest is the highest burden you can put in civil law, and it actually reverses the burden of proof. You know, unlike any other piece of legislation that gets challenged in court, where the burden is on the challenger to say why it's unconstitutional, if you're protected by compelling state interest, the burden will be on government to show that it is constitutional. And that is unique to compelling state interest and fundamental rights. What you will lose because of that terrifically high burden, what you will lose is your right to vote, your right to determine agricultural policies, your right to determine this whole industry, how it operates. You know, if you ever wanted to take any action saying there are too many antibiotics being used, it's getting into my system, it's making me it's making me resistant to antibiotics when I have a fever or some kind of situation dealing with your health. If you ever wanted to take an action in that arena, you would have lost your vote. It'll be gone.
Question on this side.
Yes, I'm Gay Pfeiffer. I'm a fifth-generation farmer from Mulhall. And as former Attorney General, I'm pretty sure that you're well aware that the Department of Environmental Quality, EPA, USDA, FDA, these are the agencies that regulate antibiotic use, runoff of chicken litter, and places like that. Now, my question is, our congressional delegation of senators and representatives, I was at a forum Monday with Senator Lankford, and they are in favor of this. So do you think that all of our congressional representatives that represent our state don't have an understanding of this state question?
I think their interests determine where their advocacy is, and I think they're very interested in support by the Farm Bureau and the Pork Council and the Poultry Council and those different corporate organizations. I also think, and I was very amused by this, you know, I haven't seen the Inhofe ad yet, but I have seen the Coburn ad on television, and he's talking about overregulation by the United States Environmental Protection Agency and the U.S. Department of Agriculture. And he said, that's why we need this constitutional amendment. Well, in all due respect to the former senator, this constitutional amendment isn't going to do anything about federal regulation. It's not going to do anything to stop EPA or USDA from coming in and telling you how to run your farm. As a matter of fact, if Oklahoma abandons its ability to engage in future regulation to meet future problems, you're going to have more EPA and more USDA coming in and taking up the slack. So if you like the federal government telling you how to run your farm, vote for 777.
There's a question here.
Okay. I'm Larry Wheatley. I'm a third generation since statehood that homesteaded here. You're looking at tunnel vision. All you're thinking about is practices. Question to anyone. If you have a farm pond on your property of 150 acres, does that water in that pond belong to you? I'm waiting for your answer.
Well, I think today, under state law, surface water belongs to the state. And I believe that to be the way the law is interpreted today. Nothing in this question changes who owns the water. Nothing in this question has any impact on how you get a water permit, whether you get a water permit, who owns the water, whether it's surface water, groundwater. Nothing in this question changes that. And so, while I understand your question, and I understand your concern about the ability to have water, because it's essential for what we do, it's simply not an issue in this question, because nothing in this question changes how water is allocated, It doesn't change who owns the water. And I'm sorry, Mr. Edmondson keeps saying we're going to abandon protection of our environment. And that's simply not true. We've already said we're going to keep the existing law in place, and we're going to give the legislature the ability to act in things that are genuinely in the best interest of the state. I fail to see how that's abandoning our ability to regulate agriculture responsibly.
I'm not sure I specifically know the answer to your question, but I would point out that the legislation dealing with wetlands, legislation dealing with navigable streams, that's federal legislation and not state legislation. So as far as the state of Oklahoma is concerned, it would say if you put a pond on your land, you own the pond. The federal government may have a different view of it. And I would like to take exception with what Roy Lee just said, that this isn't going to change anything in regard to water. It certainly will. If you have competing interests trying to get allocations of water, one has a constitutional protection and the other one doesn't, guess who wins? And if a municipal water source is trying to compete with a hog farm over who has access to a pond or a river or a lake, you know, the municipality doesn't have the power of a constitutional amendment saying that they have a protected right. So it's no longer will they be competing on an even field.
A question in the back here.
My question's for Mr. Lindsey. My name is Kenzie Bertram, and as an FFA member, I want to continue the legacy of my grandfather and my dad's ranching operation. How will I continue their operation if 777 doesn't pass?
Well, thank you for the question. I think certainly the opportunity for you to be successful long-term gets diminished if we don't provide some additional protection for agriculture going forward. And again, as I've said earlier, this is a prospective measure. We're looking down the road. We might be able today to stop anything that the animal rights activists brought to the state capitol and wanted to push as legislation. But I don't know what the legislature is going to look like in 10 years. I don't know what it's going to look like in 15, other than I know that it's going to be much more urban and it's going to be far less rural because the population base is moving into Oklahoma City, it's moving into Tulsa. And so I think long term, the ability for agriculture to have influence, the ability for agriculture to prevent bad law, if you will be greatly diminished as we go forward into the future. That's why we believe this is so important today. Again, this is about protecting ourselves for the future, protecting our ability to produce food, and protecting your choices at the grocery store on what you want to buy when you get there.
Question over here.
Well, but what it seems to me is by having your group and having this amendment, it's taking, we are the government of the people. And from now on, what if not just agriculture, but other organizations want similar amendments and so forth? We handle this and our problems, you know, by bringing them up to the people and explaining to them and having them decide, not having, you know, some set organization making all the rules for us.
Mr. Lindsey, I think the question
Sure.
is directed at you.
I believe that's what we're doing right here, is we're asking the people of Oklahoma to vote. We're asking the people to exert that power and that authority and say, yes, this is what we want for the future of agriculture. This is what we want for the future of our state. If the public says, hey, it's not what we want, they'll tell us. If they say this is what we want, it's where we'll end up. The legislature put this on the ballot, and they put it on the ballot overwhelmingly. 123 out of 148 senators and representatives voted for this to put it on the ballot. So I don't think they were concerned that they were giving away their authority. I think they said, we trust the people of Oklahoma to decide, and we're going to allow them to vote. If the issue comes up later down the road that we want to talk about a protection for oil and gas or some other industry, if it's going in the Constitution, you're going to get the same opportunity to vote on it that you get to vote on this one. So we're not taking the power away from the people to choose. We are actually asking you to choose.
Question here.
David Campbell, Stillwater resident. Oklahoma has thousands of bivocational farmers and ranchers. Folks that have a day job, plus a cattle herd or a pig farm. In fact, most of the farmers and ranchers I know fit in this category. For some time, I've been deeply concerned about their future, concerned that they will someday face excessive regulation, and that these regulations will not be based on science or fact, but on the emotional voices of non-farm activists. Further concerned that this will impact their ability to run their operations as they best see fit, and potentially make many of them decide to leave the business. If this question should fail, who in state government will protect the rights of these farmers and ranchers to choose and practice their vocation of choice?
Mr. Edmondson.
Well, that's a very good question, and I think it relates back to the question that the judge asked a little while ago, because power inherently resides with the people, and the people would make those determinations. And so far, from 1907 to 2016, the people of the state of Oklahoma have been very supportive of agriculture, of farming and ranching. And again, we're well into this program. Not a single thing has been pointed out that has ever been done in the state of Oklahoma by the legislature, by any municipality, by the State Department of Agriculture, or by the State Department of Environmental Quality that has adversely impacted farming and ranching to the point that anybody was going to go out of business. That has never happened. But I can tell you categorically, from 16 years as Attorney General, when we filed litigation in northwestern Oklahoma against hog farms, it was at the behest of the small farmers that lived around them, who see their property values declining to almost nothing because of the spreading of the waste from those hog farms on the land and the odors that it created. The same with the Bethel Baptist Church, whose kids couldn't go outside and picnic anymore because of the odor from those hog farms. And in every one of those instances, we were representing the interests of farmers and ranchers against the corporations that were not treating the land and the water appropriately. The same in eastern Oklahoma, when rural water districts were being adversely impacted by the surface application of poultry waste, when the city of Tahlequah had to spend millions of dollars to upgrade its facilities to treat the waste that was coming from big poultry companies. We were representing small farmers. We were representing people who wanted to live on the land and have sustainability against the poultry companies. And by the way, in every one of those battles, every one of them, the Farm Bureau was on the side of the corporations and against the farmers. Both sides of the state, every time.
Mr. Lindsey, I'd like to ask about that question. There's been a lot said that what's driving so much of this is large corporate agricultural interests, international companies who may have more interest in profits than than small farmers in Oklahoma.
Sure. I want to share, if you'll forgive me, a brief story here. Maybe a description is a better word. The young lady that's president of the Oklahoma Pork Council today lives in Laverne. She works for Smithfield Foods. She is the safety coordinator for Smithfield over their operations in Oklahoma, and she's also the community involvement director for them. Her husband's a production manager and works for Smithfield Foods as well on helping them be more efficient, be more effective. Their twin 11-year-old daughters are involved in cheerleading, and they're involved in gymnastics, and they're involved in other things in their community. And they go to church, and they go to school, and they volunteer. And you know what? They look just like you. They are Oklahomans, just like you are. This notion that there are these big, nameless, faceless corporations, they're easy to attack because we don't put a face with them. But the simple fact is that they provide jobs in rural Oklahoma. They provide investment in rural Oklahoma. And if you look out across the state as the population is dwindling, you ask the mayor of Guymon if he thinks that having Seaboard Foods come to Guymon in Texas County was a positive. And you know what his answer is going to be? He's got a big vote yes sign up on the side of his business. Why? Because he knows what was happening in that community before the economic opportunities from the pork industry came to Texas County. These companies provide opportunities for folks to continue to live in rural Oklahoma, to raise their family in rural Oklahoma. The things that you profess that you want for your family, the opportunities that you want to raise a family in rural Oklahoma are provided by contracts to raise poultry with Tyson, by contracts to raise hogs with Tyson, or contracts to raise hogs with one of these other entities. It allows people to remain in rural Oklahoma. And to just come out, and I'm going to club all the companies over the head with a club because I don't like companies, is just silly. That's simply not what's happening on the ground.
Thank you. We'll take one more question before
May I respond to that one?
Go ahead.
Just very briefly.
Shortly, if you could.
Smithfield Farm has employees in Harper County, but it's owned by the Chinese. It is the largest hog producer in the world, the largest hog producer in Beaver, Harper, and Ellis counties. And the people that Roy Lee's talking about aren't the ones who make the decisions. It's the Chinese that are making the decisions about how those farms are going to operate.
Yesterday, excuse me, I'm sorry to interrupt, but yesterday afternoon I got a phone call from a farmer, and this was his comment to me. The Vote No folks have been very adamant about the Chinese are coming. And his comment to me was, to listen to them, you would believe that on November the 9th, the Chinese are going to invade northwest Oklahoma. That's exactly how ridiculous that comment is.
They're here. They don't have to invade.
Okay, one more question. Here.
Hi, my name is Matt Blueball. While I'm not personally in agriculture, my family is farmed and ranched in Oklahoma for 6 generations since prior to statehood. My best friend, and I guess I have a question, but I guess it's for you now, Mr. Edmondson. A moment ago, I believe you said that no municipality or the legislature or whomever has taken an adverse action against farmers and ranchers. And I have a question, but I got kind of backstory for this real fast. My best friend lives just southwest of Crescent, in an area that near Crescent where 74 and 33 highway intersect. We're nearabouts there. And a municipality over there recently formed up called Cimarron City that didn't exist before because of a new neighborhood just around a body of water that his family owns the land on. And this municipality formed up and said that if there was a lack of agricultural activity, and they defined it vaguely in their covenants, for a 3-month period or longer, that they were going to rezone those folks into residential or business, strictly through zoning codes. And I'm sure that's probably for tax purposes. But in that scenario, luckily things worked out in the end there. But they had some trouble for a while. And
so what's your question?
My question is, in what situation, without passing this, because right now, the burden of proof would be on those people to say that to prove the city wrong. But with passing this, I mean, my question is, what would we be able to do to stop that in the future? That can use to happen with these expanding municipalities. What else than this could we do to prevent that?
Thank you.
As I understand your question, the city of Crescent was looking at land that was zoned agricultural?
It was Cimarron City, sir.
Cimarron City?
So they said that if there was a lack of agricultural activity, that rezoned them for a 3-month period, which any crop in this state, you're going to have about 3 months of inactivity, depending on what it is, based on the winter. It's like telling me my house, if I don't mow my lawn, I can't have one if I don't mow for 3 months. I just didn't know if
I guess the question is, if it passes, what options would people have to prevent certain...
If it doesn't pass it? If it does not pass, I'm sorry about that. I apologize. If it doesn't pass, then what tool do we have in our toolbox to prevent them from zoning us out? And
if 777 does not pass, you would have whatever rights you have today to challenge an ordinance by a municipality. A municipality, on the other hand, would have the right to take land that is zoned agriculture that's not being used for agricultural purposes and rezone it. They're concerned, the cities are concerned, that they're going to lose that right under 777, and that land zoned agricultural cannot be governed by a municipality, even if it's within the city limits, and they're very concerned about that. I don't know about 2 months of activity or 3 months. I think the question would be, is it being used for agricultural purposes or is it not?
All right, I'd like to give our guests one last chance to make their case for or against this proposal. Mr. Edmondson, would you like to start? In about 30 seconds, if you could.
Yes, and I'd like to start kind of where I started off, and to quote Sue Selman again, because one of the things she mentioned in the letter, and I hope you get a chance to read it, she is concerned about the legacy that she wants to leave for her grandchildren, the legacy of her ranch in Harper County. And she is concerned that that legacy is threatened by the adoption of 777. This is a centennial rancher in Harper County. I share that concern. The Oklahoma Municipal League shares that concern. Newspapers across the state of Oklahoma share that concern. The Intertribal Council of the 5 Civilized Tribes share that concern. Environmental groups share that concern, as well as animal rights groups. It's a concern that we all have, particularly when that Independent City is the closest anybody's come to pointing out anything that's happened in the state of Oklahoma ever to give rise to a demand for 777. And that's pretty shaky, really. So the need is not there, the harm is not there, and the solution has at least potentially dire consequences for the state of Oklahoma. And if there's no need and potential harm, the answer is vote no.
Mr. Lindsey.
Thank you all for coming. I appreciate you taking time to learn what I think is a very important question that's on the ballot November 8th. When I look across the room and I try to come up with, okay, so here's the sales pitch, if you will, at the end of the event, why I need you to vote yes. I don't have to look a whole lot farther than the young people standing in the back of the room in their blue and gold jackets. To me, they're the future of agriculture. They're the people that are going to feed you in the future. They're the folks that are going to work tirelessly every day to see that you have the safest, most affordable, most abundant food supply in the world. They're the folks that want to see that you have the choices you want when you go to the grocery store. Whether you want to buy conventionally produced eggs, whether you want to pay a premium for cage-free eggs, that's your choice. And we embrace that choice. We encourage you to vote with your pocketbook on how you want your food produced every day. But we don't need the Humane Society of the United States coming into Oklahoma as they've done in states all across the country. And Mr. Edmondson talks about legislative exchange councils pushing legislation across the country and how he thinks that's a horrible idea. Well, what do you think the Humane Society of the United States is doing? They're doing the same thing. They're pushing their agenda all across the country. So when I think about why am I asking you to vote yes, look at the groups that are supporting this question. They're your friends, they're your neighbors, in many cases they're your family. They're the small farmers and ranchers of this state. Look at the membership of those organizations. See who they are. Call them and ask them. Don't take my word for it. Pick up the phone and call them and ask them. The veterinarians in the state have said this is not about animal care. Otherwise, they wouldn't endorse this question. They believe we'll still take care of our animals. And I know that we're teaching these young people how best to care for their animals, how best to care for the environment. And I'm asking you to vote yes on 777 to protect their future and to protect your choices at the grocery store.
A hand of applause for our guests.